It was almost obscene how quiet that glass boardroom stayed when I walked in carrying a clear zipper bag with two torn pieces of deep red lace and set it in the center of the table. 12 executives turned toward me at once, their expressions shifting from annoyance to confusion, then to something colder when they saw Derek Sutton go pale beside Lila Mercer. He half rose from his chair and tried to get ahead of the moment with, "Madeline, please, just let me explain." But the tremor in his voice had already exposed more than any confession could. Lila pulled her hand off his thigh so fast the movement almost disappeared, yet not fast enough to erase what everyone in that room had already seen before I opened my bag. The chief executive leaned back, eyes moving from the lace to Derek, then to me, and asked with clipped restraint, "What exactly is this? And why are you here?" I kept my voice even and said I was there to submit evidence tied to an undisclosed relationship and vendor misconduct before the board made a decision it would not be able to take back. That was the moment Owen Price, the compliance manager, noticed the silver USB in my hand and stood without being asked, because he understood this had already crossed out of private disgrace. I placed the drive beside the zipper bag and told him the files were organized in sequence, beginning with the relationship Derek failed to disclose and ending with the contract irregularities attached to Lila's consulting work. No one interrupted me then, not even Derek, because the bag on the polished wood and the drive beside it had changed the room from ambition to exposure in less than a minute. Owen inserted the USB into the boardroom laptop, and the first image that hit the screen showed Derek leaving a private work club with Lila close enough to fix his collar like habit. A second file followed with restaurant charges, hotel invoices, and timed receipts that lined up perfectly with nights he told me he was still at the office. Still working. Still too exhausted to come home whole. By the time the chief executive looked back at Derek and asked whether there were any conflicts of interest he wanted to disclose now, nobody in that room was waiting for his answer anymore. I was 34 then, and my work sounded quiet to anyone who had never spent years tracking what belongs where. What went missing, and what was misplaced. I was a senior collections registrar at a moving image archive in Portland, and my days were built around provenance, chain of custody, labels, and discrepancies that usually meant more than they first appeared. That was why the first irregularity in my marriage did not feel dramatic when I saw it. Only sharp. A handwritten address in Derek Sutton's planner beside the words 9:30 private review. He told me he had a routine vendor check-in, kissed my cheek, grabbed his keys, and left with the rhythm of someone expecting no questions. Later, while processing loan paperwork at work, I checked his company calendar for that address because the note had stayed with me, and there was nothing there. The blank space bothered me more than a bad excuse would have, because men telling the truth leave traces, and lies erase the ones that should exist. That evening, Derek dropped his jacket over the banister and went upstairs talking about deadlines. A strained team, and one more day that had taken everything out of him. I picked it up on reflex, and before I looked at the tag, I caught a fragrance threaded through the wool. Smoky amber layered with a floral note that was not mine. By then I was no longer asking whether something was wrong, only how long it had been wrong without me naming it. I changed the bedsheets that night with the tired efficiency of someone finishing one last task before sleep, and that was when I found the lace. A sliver of crimson fabric was caught beneath the bed frame where dust and forgotten things settle when no one looks under there long enough. I stood still, holding it between two fingers. Not crying. Not shaking. Just watching piece of evidence change the room faster than any confession could have. The next morning, Joan Whitaker studied my face across a steel work table stacked with accession folders and asked whether I had slept at all, because I looked like someone who had been listening all night. I gave her a smile too controlled to pass for ease, turned back to the paperwork, and said nothing because the lace in my bag had already said enough. By lunch, I had photographed it, sealed it in an archival sleeve, noted the date, time, and location, and opened a folder on my laptop called Project Glass Ledger. The next morning, I drove to the private work club from Derek's planner, parked across the street, and waited until my pulse settled into something sharp enough to trust. When I walked in, the receptionist smiled, and I asked whether Derek Sutton was already upstairs for his 9:30 reservation. She checked the screen, nodded, and told me he was in a private room with Lila Mercer, which was the first confirmation that did not come from me. I thanked her, took the elevator up, and stepped into a hallway lined with frosted glass doors and thick carpet that swallowed every sound before it could travel. I did not knock, because I was not there to plead. And by then, confirmation had become more useful to me than emotion. A minute later, the door opened, and Derek came out beside Lila, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm before she straightened his collar. I raised my phone and captured 6 clean seconds, then several stills, because the ease between them had already crossed beyond anything a professional explanation could rescue. Derek bent toward her when she spoke. Lila laughed like she already belonged inside every private corner of his schedule, and neither of them bothered looking around. Watching them walk past me without seeing me confirmed the affair, and their carelessness told me this was no beginning, only a habit I had reached late. On the drive home, I remembered Derek mentioning a consultant months earlier, someone brilliant with vendors who supposedly knew how to save difficult negotiations. He had spoken her name only once, but hearing Lila Mercer at reception brought it back with the precision of a label rediscovered in the right box. By the time I reached the house, I understood the woman leaving that room was tied to more than desire and more than coincidence. That night, I logged into our joint account after Derek texted that he was trapped in back-to-back meetings and might be home late. Restaurant bills, boutique hotel charges, ride shares after midnight, and a dinner coded as vendor hospitality for only 2 people lined up, with nights he claimed work kept him away. I opened each line item slowly, because every timestamp was starting to lock his excuses to something firmer than memory and harder than apology. Later, while emptying his jacket pockets before bed, I found a narrow receipt from a fragrance boutique folded twice behind a parking stub. The purchase listed a candle, cologne, and the customer name Lila Mercer, which made the scent on his jacket stop feeling suspicious and start reading fully exact. The next day, I took the receipt to the store, asked the clerk to confirm the transaction number, and left after she smiled and said Lila buys for him often. The next morning, Derek left before sunrise, tying his shoes too fast, muttering about vendor revisions, and pulling the front door shut with the force of someone outrunning scrutiny. After he was gone, I knelt beside the bed looking for an earring back, reached into the narrow gap beside the nightstand, and touched lace again. This time, there were 2 torn pieces, darker than the first and twisted together in the dust, which made one thing immediately clear to me. This was repetition. I held the fabric in my palm and understood the difference between discovering betrayal once and discovering your home had been used often enough to leave layers. The first sliver of lace could have been explained by a liar thinking quickly, but 2 more pieces hidden deeper inside the room turned habit into fact. I sealed them in separate archival sleeves, labeled the exact location, and set them beside the first piece, because frequency becomes proof when evidence keeps repeating. Standing there with 3 pieces of lace on my desk, I stopped seeing the bedroom as a marriage and started seeing it as a documented site. That shift changed the next hour, because once I understood Derek and Lila had grown careless inside my walls, I understood they had grown careless elsewhere. I walked into Derek's home office, looked at the slim filing cabinet beneath the shelves, and entered our anniversary into the keypad without hesitating even once. The lock released on the first try, and inside I found tax forms, printed budgets, and one folder marked outreach revisions in Derek's clipped handwriting there. I opened it at my desk and found vendor comparison sheets, revised pricing tables, and a side letter attaching Lila Mercer to the project directly there. The problem was visible before I reached the last page. because the numbers did not move like ordinary revisions. They jumped and buried margin inside vague language. I kept reading and found line items relabeled as strategy facilitation, production, alignment, and integration support. Broad enough to slip through rushed final approval meetings unnoticed. Beside those tables sat printed emails between Derek and Lila discussing board pressure and the need to keep revisions outside the standard internal purchasing review process. I did not need a law degree to understand what those pages were pointing toward, because hidden fees and a concealed relationship sat together there already. My phone buzzed while I was still reading, and the message came from an unknown number with no greeting. Only one instruction. Check the appendix carefully. I pulled the revised Learning Media appendix from the folder, compared the figures line by line, and saw where the real increase had been buried there. Then I called Nina Caldwell, and after I read her the labels exactly as they appeared on the pages, she told me not to confront Derek yet. Nina told me to preserve everything, document how I found it, and separate what belonged in divorce files from what belonged with company compliance review immediately. That night, I built 4 folders on my laptop for the relationship: the spending timeline, the physical evidence, and the contract documents I had found there carefully. When Derek texted that he was still at the office preparing for the board, his location sat at Lila Mercer's building, so I added one more timestamp quietly. The next morning, I stepped out of the elevator on the executive floor, knowing Derek believed he was walking into the cleanest win of his career. Not the moment everything would stop. Through the glass wall, I could already see him at the long table. Jacket buttoned. Posture easy. Leaning toward Lila Mercer with the confidence of a man who thought every risk had been contained. She sat there as if she had earned her place through talent alone, one hand resting near his notebook, both of them wearing that polished, calm people mistake for innocence when success seems close enough to touch. By the time the board settled, Derek had already arranged his face into the version of himself executives trusted. Focused. Composed. Careful with language. Hungry without looking reckless. Lila had her presentation deck open, legal pads aligned, and the kind of stillness that only comes from believing the room is already yours. I stayed outside until the chief executive opened the meeting and asked whether there were any conflicts, disclosures, or irregularities that needed to be addressed before final approval moved forward. Derek answered too smoothly, "No conflicts on my end." And hearing that lie spoken into a room built for record and consequence told me it was time. I opened the door, crossed the threshold without hurrying, and felt every head turn toward me before anyone had fully processed who I was or why I had come. Derek rose halfway from his seat, color draining from his face, and tried to stop the moment with, "Madeline, this is not the place." But by then, the place was exactly the point. I set the clear bag on the table first, then the silver USB beside it, and said I was there to submit evidence relevant to undisclosed relationships and vendor misconduct before the board voted. Lila's hand left Derek's thigh so quickly it almost vanished. But not before the chief executive saw the motion and shifted his attention from me to them with visible restraint. Owen Price stood from the far end of the table, looked at the drive in my hand, and said quietly that if the materials involved compliance exposure, he needed to review them immediately. I placed the drive in front of him and told him the files were organized in sequence, beginning with the relationship Derek had concealed and ending with the contract documents tied to Lila's consulting role. Owen inserted the USB into the room laptop, opened the first folder, and the screen filled with the still image of Derek leaving the private work club while Lila fixed his collar, like familiarity had long ago become routine. A second file followed with timed restaurant charges, hotel receipts, rideshare logs, and the fragrance purchase in Lila Mercer's name, all lining up with nights. Derek told me he was working late or managing vendor emergencies. The room changed when Owen opened the pricing documents, because the affair could still have been dismissed as private disgrace if it had remained only physical. But the revised tables, the relabeled fees, the side letter, and the emails discussing pressure around final approval pulled the story straight into the company's duty to act. Derek tried to recover by saying this was a personal matter being weaponized by an angry spouse. But the chief executive cut him off and asked why a personal matter appeared inside vendor documents his team had never disclosed. Lila tried to steady her voice and say her consulting work had been handled properly. Yet the appendix on the screen showed the buried margin too clearly for performance to help her now. Owen kept opening files. Legal asked for copies. HR entered before anyone called for them. And Derek's badge and laptop ended up on the table where his promotion packet had been waiting minutes earlier. When I turned and walked back through the glass door, I left them inside the room they had mistaken for victory. And for the first time in months, I felt no confusion at all. Within 48 hours, the company issued an internal notice, confirming a formal review into procurement misconduct and an undisclosed relationship that compromised the approval process Derek had tried to control. By Monday morning, his employment was terminated, his access revoked, and his name shifted from rising executive to the kind of liability no careful company keeps near vendors. Lila Mercer's consulting agreement was canceled the same day. And the same documents that once opened doors for her now closed them faster than reputation usually falls. Portland did what cities like Portland always do, with professional scandal, which was not scream it in public but pass it quietly through conference calls, lunches, and narrowed pauses. People did not need every page from the file to understand enough. Because Derek's badge was gone, Lila's contract disappeared, and the board delayed the decision they expected. The social part mattered less to me than the legal one. Yet watching consequence spread beyond my house confirmed that what I uncovered had never been only intimate. I met Nina Caldwell the next morning in her office, signed the divorce petition, and listened as she walked me through the asset separation we had already prepared. The house, my savings, my retirement contributions, and everything clearly traceable to my income stayed with me, which meant I was not taking from Derek, only keeping myself intact. When he showed up outside her office later with hollow eyes and asked, "Madeline, please, can we fix this?" I heard a stranger asking for access, not a husband asking for grace. I told him no without raising my voice. Because the records, the receipts, the files, and the lies had already finished every argument long before he arrived. He stood there trying to look wrecked enough to deserve mercy, but the only thing I recognized was panic, now that consequences had reached him personally. I left him there, sold the house weeks later, accepted a position in Santa Fe, and packed only what still felt like mine when his name was removed. New Mexico gave me a smaller house, cleaner mornings, and a pace that never asked me to explain why peace felt unfamiliar before it began feeling earned. I adopted an older rescue dog, built a life that held steady without performance, and understood healing was not softness but the return of authority over my own days. The last time Derek called and said he had lost everything, I looked out at the dry evening light and answered, "You started losing it when you believed the truth could be managed. If you stayed with me through this, thank you for hearing a story that began in ruin and ended where peace finally felt stronger than grief. If any part of it felt familiar, stay close and share your voice below. I hope you find the kind of love that leaves nothing to recover from."